In the heart of the Russian city of Kursk, advancing tanks and enemy fire marked the rhythm of one of the fiercest battles of World War II. Perhaps not as remembered as the clashes at Stalingrad, Midway, and Normandy, this titanic struggle still represented a turning point in the conflict. Millions of soldiers fought and died in the steppes and trenches around the city, while killer machines sowed destruction all around them. Never before or since in history have so many tanks and planes been seen in the same battle. Both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, the sinister minds behind this conflict, knew that whoever was the winner would claim the final victory. That is why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the Battle of Kursk, the battle that marked the destiny of the Third Reich. According to many historians, the second half of 1942, almost at the midpoint of World War II, marked the beginning of the end for the Axis forces. The Japanese Empire lost most of its fleet to the Americans at the Battle of Midway in June of that year. By August, the Allies had successfully landed on German lands in North Africa and had managed to gain the upper hand in that brutal arena. But for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, the greatest danger lay on the Eastern Front. The campaign against the Soviet Union, which began on June 22, 1941, had brought huge initial victories for the German side. The Russian defenders could do little against the meticulously organized movements of tanks, planes, and infantry that were sweeping through their positions. Leningrad to the north was under siege, its people slowly starving to death. Moscow was in constant danger, with Axis troops just a few miles from the capital. But the bloodiest fighting took place in the south of the country, in the city named after the nation's leader, Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began on July 17, 1942, is considered by many to be one of the most important battles of the entire Second World War, and was undoubtedly the deadliest. For more than 6 months, the Germans fought in the factories, buildings, and houses of the city in bloody hand-to-hand combat. The Soviets were very close to being defeated, which would mean their total annihilation. But thanks to the iron will of soldiers and citizens, they were able to expel the invaders in January 1943. Not only that, but the counteroffensive that followed completely eliminated an entire Nazi army. Stalin's men and women managed to seize the initiative for the first time in the war against Germany, immediately planning new attacks. Hitler, for his part, had never before been in such a fragile situation. But despite the nearly 500,000 German corpses now lying beneath the snows of Stalingrad, the Third Reich was far from defeated. The Führer's engineers had built a new machine that, in the words of the Nazi leader, would change the course of the war. This was the tank known as the Tiger I. Although it was slower than the Soviet T-34 battleships, this steel beast was far more powerful, and its 88mm shells were capable of destroying the thickest armor. It had already been tested in combat with deadly results, but it was soon to go into mass production. Now it was only a matter of choosing the location for unleashing these terrible weapons. Hitler was forced to choose quickly, as the Red Army was advancing rapidly through territory previously conquered by the Germans. When the Nazi forces around Stalingrad were annihilated, they left an opening in the lines that the Soviets were quick to exploit with savage counteroffensives. By early February 1943, many Russian cities had been liberated. Among them was Kursk, a place that would soon become the scene of one of the most spectacular battles of the entire Second World War. This settlement had been conquered by the Nazis in the first days of November 1941, during their initial string of victories. For almost 15 months, the Germans terrorized the local population. It is estimated that approximately 10,000 civilians died in that time, victims of the indiscriminate killings or the starvation that ravaged the city. When the German armies were driven back in 1943, most of the buildings were in ruins, and hundreds of explosive mines lay hidden in the streets and houses, ready to detonate at the footsteps of the Red Army soldiers. Traces of Nazism were still present. Despite the devastation, Kursk remained a place of strategic value for both armies. For several months, the forces clashed around this city, with no significant changes in the battlefront. The offensives lost their impetus with the arrival of spring and the rains, which turned the terrain into a muddy field, making the movement of troops and tanks difficult. By mid-1943, the Soviets had managed to penetrate deep into Nazi territory, keeping Kursk behind the front lines. The Germans were forced to allocate many of their resources to this region if they wanted to prevent the advance of their enemy. If Hitler could eliminate this point, he would be able to divert more men and equipment to the rest of the front. The plan was called Operation Citadel, and for many German generals, the Third Reich's victory in the war depended on its success. But unlike when the Nazis first invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Joseph Stalin was now prepared. He knew the Führer's intentions, and he decided to use them to his advantage. The citizens of Kursk were asked to assist in preparing the local defenses. Most did so voluntarily, eager to help drive the Germans from their homes. In addition to digging nearly 5,000 kilometers of trenches for the soldiers, they fixed the streets and built new ones so that the tanks could move faster. The city was preparing to be the nightmare of Hitler's men. After this was completed, many took on support duties behind the lines, as cooks, drivers, or medical personnel. By July 1943, more than 1 million Soviet fighters were stationed north and south of Kursk, awaiting the possibility of a massive counterattack. But there was a risk in Stalin's plan: Adolf Hitler's new war toy. Nearly 800,000 Nazis were approaching with 700 tanks, 150 of which were Tiger Is. If the Germans could break through the Soviet barriers, they would have the opportunity to push deep into the territory, surround the defenders, and annihilate them, as they had done many times in 1941. For Hitler and his generals, their new monstrous armored vehicles would be able to accomplish this task. On July 5, 1943, the Soviets, knowing that the Nazi offensive was about to begin, launched a massive artillery attack in the hope of disorganizing their movements. But while they delayed the German advance for a few hours, they failed to stop them. Ordered to march toward the defensive lines, Operation Citadel began. The first attacks took place north of Kursk, led by German General Walter Model. He was considered a cautious commander who preferred defensive methods to direct offensives, so he kept his tanks in the rear. In turn, he ordered his men to advance and try to break through the Soviet lines. But a terrible surprise awaited them. The Red Army fighters had taken advantage of the vast network of trenches to move unseen and place thousands of explosive mines. When the Germans entered the enemy positions, they began to be blown up. The soldiers saw their colleagues being mutilated, while shots rained down around them. This is recounted in some testimonies recorded in German diaries, such as that of a German minesweeper that we can hear next. Despite the heavy casualties, Model still did not give his tanks the order to advance, but south of Kursk it was a different story. There, the command was held by Marshal Erich von Manstein, who did not hesitate to deploy the Reich's new weapons. At his command, the Tigers advanced in the vanguard, flanked by older tanks to protect these valuable battleships. Some of the crews were made up of members of the SS, the most bloodthirsty organization within the National Socialist Party. They were responsible for Hitler's personal security and control in the concentration camps, but they were also used in traditional battles. Soviet soldiers felt the deepest hatred towards them, as they had been responsible for the greatest atrocities within their territory. The SS tanks were more successful than Model's attack in the north. The Tigers advanced slowly but surely, destroying everything in their path. Shells from Soviet vehicles and artillery bounced off their 10-centimeter thick steel armor. The The Red Army's T-34s, though more agile, did not have this protection, and many were pulverized by the guns of the new German battleships. The defenders could not even escape by taking refuge in the trenches, as the sheer weight of the tanks would eventually collapse them.
The German tank advance is relentless.
After 4 days of intense fighting, many of the Soviet defensive lines on the southern flank had collapsed, and the Germans found themselves in a favorable position. If they were able to continue their victories, they could encircle the enemy forces around Kursk and destroy them. But just as the Nazis were on the verge of victory, Hitler received devastating news. While the Germans were concentrated in and around Kursk, on July 9, 1943, the Western Allies invaded the island of Sicily in southern Italy. Now the Führer had to make a decision: ignore the new battlefront and risk the British and Americans moving deeper into Europe, or send resources there, taking them out of the fight against the Soviets. He was forced to decide quickly because Stalin and his generals did not plan to sit idly by. Seeing that their defensive lines were close to being overcome, the Soviet commanders decided to activate their armored reserves. German soldiers on the front line watched in complete terror as nearly 800 T-34s appeared on the horizon, moving rapidly toward their positions. The largest tank battle in history was about to begin. The Tiger crews opened fire. Many of the Russian vehicles were destroyed without being able to fire a single shell, but hundreds more managed to get close enough to fire. At short range, the mobility of the T-34s was a huge advantage over the slow German tanks, and their thick armor was of little use when firing at point-blank range. In addition, many Soviet factories had been ordered to build these battleships, so they could easily make up for the number of units destroyed. In contrast, each disabled Tiger was a noticeable loss. While the vehicles exchanged fire, Soviet soldiers fought the Nazis in the trenches, where fighting frequently turned hand-to-hand. In the air, there were also savage clashes between the planes of the two sides. Unlike the other nations participating in World War II, the Soviet Union allowed women to fly fighter aircraft just like men. During the Battle of Kursk, some of these pilots excelled. Such was the case of Lydia Litviak, who at the age of 21 had already shot down 13 enemy planes, still holding the record for kills in aerial combat. Despite her victories, the fighting in the Soviet steppes was brutal, and not even the most skilled were exempt from death. Despite the losses, planes flew over the fields and villages of Kursk, and tanks continued to fight in a brutal and chaotic battle. Although the number of dead was enormous, the battle lines had barely shifted a few meters. By the 11th of July, 1943, destroyed battleships were everywhere, their smoking hulls obscuring the vision of the survivors. Although the Soviet defenses had not been overcome, the number of vehicles lost was staggering, with almost 200 casualties. The Germans, on the other hand, lost only a few dozen. Field Marshal von Manstein was convinced that a new offensive would be able to break through the enemy lines, but he needed to coordinate his movements with Walter Model to the north. However, as we have mentioned, this general was cautious by nature, and he had only managed to advance 10 kilometers from his initial position. Although his colleagues' bold strategies in the south had proved more successful, he continued to fail to fully employ his tanks, and the German offensive lost momentum. Stalin and his military advisors knew that they had to make a preemptive strike if they were to retain control of Kursk, and they all decided that it had to be against the northern flank. This was done on July 12, 1943, with Operation Kutuzov. 1 million men, 2,400 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft advanced against the German positions almost without warning. The Nazis had not expected an attack of this magnitude, thinking that the Soviets were ready to collapse, and they were taken by surprise. Von Manstein urged Hitler to organize a counterattack to avoid being swept away by the Red Army, but the Führer had other ideas. The Allies continued to advance in Sicily, and the Axis troops there were at risk of being destroyed. Much to the marshal's chagrin, the Nazi leader decided to withdraw several armored units from Kursk to strengthen his defenses on the Italian island. This marked the end of Operation Citadel and of the German offensive. But the Soviet attack was only just beginning. Taking advantage of the momentum caused by seeing their enemy retreat, the tanks and soldiers advanced at a very good pace. Although the Germans destroyed bridges and burned fields in an attempt to slow down the Red Army, they could not contain the attack. By 23 August 1943, the Germans had been driven back to the outskirts of the city of Kharkov, 200 kilometers from Kursk. The fall of the Nazis began there, and their decline would continue at an accelerated pace until the end of World War II. The Battle of Kursk is considered the largest battle in all of military history, as well as one of the bloodiest. It is estimated that around 100,000 German soldiers lost their lives, and more than 250 tanks, including the new Tigers, were destroyed. Soviet casualties were even worse, more than 200,000 men killed and almost 2,000 tanks disabled. Despite the large number of losses, the victory they achieved was of immense tactical value. After Kursk, the Nazis never went on the offensive on the Eastern Front. The Soviets, on the other hand, began an advance that would not stop until the gates of Berlin, almost 2 years later, where Stalin would give the final blow to the already dying Third Reich of the Führer. The Battle of Berlin is undoubtedly one of the best known and most emblematic of the entire Second World War. It marked the end of the fighting in Europe, and during the course of it, Adolf Hitler decided to take his own life rather than surrender. But there was a previous conflict that, despite its importance, is often overlooked. This was the Oder-Neisse offensive, in which the fate of the German capital would be decided. Millions of Soviet soldiers faced a demoralized German defense, greatly inferior in number. Despite this, if Joseph Stalin's men thought that their victory was assured, they were faced with the reality that the Germans were not yet completely defeated. The Führer's orders were clear. They had to fight until the last drop of blood. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the Battle of Oder-Neisse. Some historians mark the beginning of the road to Berlin in a battle that took place almost 3,000 kilometers away from the German capital. In July 1942, the Nazis reached the gates of Stalingrad in the south of the Soviet Union. This city was their next objective after the previous conquests. Places of great importance such as Smolensk and Sevastopol had fallen into German hands, bringing with them the death of hundreds of thousands of men of the Soviet Union. Everything seemed to indicate that, as had happened in those battles, they would have no problems in winning a new fight against the rickety Red Army. For Hitler, taking the city that bore the name of the enemy leader would be a victory not only tactical, but symbolic, which would bring him closer to total domination. But Stalin and his generals were also aware of this, and that is why they decided that it would not fall into Nazi hands under any circumstances. Order 227 was issued, which declared that not one step back would be taken. Anyone who deserted his post would be shot by his superiors. But rather than increasing the soldiers' resentment against their officers, it motivated them to defend their homeland to the death. Thanks to the courage and sacrifice of the Soviet fighters, Stalingrad held out for months, much longer than the Führer had expected. In addition, the invaders had to face the terrible Russian winter, with temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero. The death toll on the German side was in the tens of thousands. Food and medicine were scarce, while disease was spreading rapidly. The Soviets took advantage of this situation to reinforce the areas around Stalingrad, preparing for an eventual offensive that would liberate the place. Although his generals advised him to retreat to reorganize the attack, for Hitler, the capture of the city had become a matter of personal pride.
Hitler is acutely aware of the symbolism of Stalingrad as a symbol of Stalin himself and as a symbol of new Soviet man and Soviet industry. Hitler just wants to go for Stalingrad because it's Stalingrad.
Like Stalin, Hitler gave the order that retreat was completely forbidden. But unlike what happened with the communist forces, the effect was not at all motivating. Completely surrounded, constantly suffering from hypothermia and starvation, this ended up cementing the final fate of the Nazi forces. In early 1943, the entire German army was surrounded in the snowy Soviet steppes outside the city, and its general had no choice but to sign the surrender. 91,000 soldiers were captured, and almost twice that number died in combat. The victory at Stalingrad raised the morale of the people and soldiers of the communist country and gave them enough energy to launch their massive counterattack. Quite the opposite happened with the Germans, who saw how the myth of their supposed invincibility bled into the snow along with their men. In the following months, the Soviets advanced with terrible fury against their enemies, reaping more victories than defeats. The Germans, who had also had to deal with setbacks in Africa and Italy, found themselves on the defensive for the first time in the war, and their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. By 1945, the Third Reich seemed to be on the ropes. Almost all of the territories they had conquered in the previous years had already been liberated. Their allies, including Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Italy, had already signed their surrender and in some cases even began to fight against them. Western powers such as the United States and England had landed on the French coast in 1944 and were advancing at a good pace towards the German heartland. By October of that year, they were already on Reich soil, with several towns and cities in their hands. German counteroffensives, such as that in the Ardennes, did not have the desired effect and could not prevent the American advance. But even so, the greatest danger for Hitler was on the Eastern Front. In the first days of 1945, the Soviet army was on Polish territory. The Baltic countries had been almost completely liberated, as had the area of East Prussia. But Joseph Stalin was faced with a dilemma. The leader was very suspicious of his Western allies. He believed that, after Germany was defeated, they would divide up the conquered territory in their favor, ignoring Soviet requests. To prevent this, instead of indicating a direct advance towards Berlin, the Russian leader ordered the launching of a large-scale offensive on a wide front. His idea was to take over as much area as possible so that it would not fall into English or American hands. Of course, his main objective was always the capture of the German capital. This city not only had enormous symbolic value, but was also where important resources were located. For example, part of the German research on the atomic bomb was located there. Of course, Hitler was also an important target. The German leader had moved to his headquarters in Berlin, attentive to the development of the last days of the war.
He really saw Berlin as the center of Nazi Germany. He saw capturing Berlin as a moment when the Soviet Union would quite literally physically overrun the Nazis, in much the same way that the Nazis believed that capturing Moscow would be the symbolic moment of the conquest of the Soviet Union.
The Soviet campaign that would eventually reach Berlin began on January 12th. On that day, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. The goal was to finish retaking the territory of Poland, one of the few countries still under German control. In a little over 2 weeks, the Nazis were forced to abandon major cities such as Warsaw and Krakow. The concentration camps that lay along the way, for example Auschwitz, were also liberated, although the Germans continued to commit brutalities until the last moment. Death walks, where prisoners were forced to march hundreds of miles to another center, often without any shelter, were very common. Thousands died along the way, victims of cold, exhaustion, or gunfire from guards. By February, the Soviets crossed the banks of the Oder River. They were now officially in enemy territory. The war had reached Germany. At certain points, only 60 kilometers separated them from Berlin, so Hitler wanted to consolidate his defenses to protect the capital. He, however, believed that the Soviet attack would be directed at Hungary, since the Reich's last oil wells were located there. Although some of his generals protested, the leader directed several of his remaining forces to this front, taking them away from others. One of his most vocal detractors was Heinz Guderian, an expert in tank combat. He was able to convince the Führer to mount an attack where he thought the Russian offensive would be, on the banks of the Oder River, but this was not as successful. Nevertheless, it forced the Soviets to postpone their advance, seeing that the Germans were not as defeated as they thought. But the Germans did not take advantage of this pause to strengthen Berlin's defenses, since they believed that doing so would cause the citizens to panic. In addition, Hitler remained convinced that the capital was not Stalin's main objective. That was why the city's garrison, which was mostly made up of barely trained militia and members of the Hitler Youth, was not reinforced. According to several witnesses, the Führer was completely out of touch with German reality. He continued to seek to regain the initiative, when in truth he had lost it at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. Even though he received daily reports about Soviet movements on the banks of the Oder, he chose to ignore them. Almost none of his generals dared to contradict him, and the few who did risked being dismissed. Meanwhile, the leader demanded increasingly cruel directives, even from his own people. Among them was the Nero Order, which dictated that not 1 centimeter of fertile land should fall into enemy hands, burning it down if his men were forced to retreat. He also ruled that if a civilian waved a white flag, indicating his surrender, he should be executed as a traitor to the fatherland. In this way, he sought to get the entire German population to take part in the defense of the country.
Hitler decreed, quote, "Our nation's struggle for existence forces us to utilize all means, even within Reich territory, to weaken the fighting power of our enemy and to prevent further advances. Any opportunity to inflict lasting damage on the striking power of the enemy must be taken advantage of. It is a mistake to believe that undestroyed or only temporarily paralyzed traffic, communications, industrial, and supply installations will be useful to us again after the recapture of lost territories. During his retreat, the enemy will leave behind only scorched earth and will abandon all concern for the population."
Hitler made his decisions knowing that, Unfortunately for him, the quality of his army was not at all the same as when he had started his campaign of conquest. His most experienced soldiers had been killed or captured on the various fronts where he fought. The majority of his forces were made up of old men or children, incapable of facing the millions of revenge-hungry Soviets. The training they received was not sufficient, and they functioned more as cannon fodder than as effective combat units. Several German counterattacks were attempted, but while some were able to slow the Soviet advance, they all failed in one fundamental matter. None produced such significant damage that it would prevent Stalin's troops from continuing to advance into Germany, liberating territories conquered by the Nazis in their path, such as Austria and the Czech Republic. By April 16th, the German collapse was imminent. Hitler and his most important advisors and generals were in an underground bunker inside Berlin, thinking about how to reverse their bad fortune. Meanwhile, Dwight Eisenhower, the general in charge of the Allied forces in Europe, contacted Stalin. He informed him that the objective of the Western units was Bavaria, in southeastern Germany, to prevent the Nazis from fleeing and regrouping in the mountains. The Soviet leader relaxed, knowing that his long-awaited prize would be his. He ordered his men to begin what would be the last offensive of the entire war in Europe. The Battle of the Oder-Neisse began, named after the rivers that ran near the German capital. German defenses had been set up along these two waterways, but as mentioned above, they were not in great shape. They were outnumbered by the Russians by a ratio of 10-1, and also had far fewer tanks, aircraft, and other vehicles. The first battles of this campaign occurred in the Seelow Hills. Here the last fighting took place, of a pitched nature, unlike the urban fighting of the last days of the war. The Soviets started first, with a massive artillery barrage on the German positions. In just half an hour, 500,000 shells were fired. This was followed by the advance of the Red Army, which drove the Germans back. However, the marshy terrain in which the battle was taking place made progress slower than expected, and made the Soviets easy prey for Nazi attacks. Because of this, Marshal Zhukov, in charge of the attack, had to confess to Stalin that the plans were not going as expected.
A belt of 88mm flak guns concealed along the foot of the Seelow heights took a heavy toll of the Soviet armor. Every bush and hedge on the heights concealed defensive positions, many of which had survived the bombardments that preceded various phases of the attack.
Although the number of casualties was high, reinforcements arrived the next day. To try to counter them, several German units stationed in Berlin were brought to the front, but they were unable to turn the situation around. The Soviets, thanks to their vast numerical superiority, were able to overwhelm the defenders. By the evening of the 17th, the Communists had managed to advance about 15 kilometers inland. Around Seelow, things were even worse for the locals. To the south, the 1st Ukrainian Front was dueling with soldiers of the German Army Group Center in what became known as the Cottbus-Potsdam Offensive. The latter's forces were even more weakened, and they were barely able to hold out for a day before being overwhelmed. German General Ferdinand Schörner had 2 armored units in reserve, but he did not decide to use them to strengthen his defense. This proved to be a serious mistake. By the evening of that day, their positions were becoming untenable, and they had to retreat to avoid being encircled. On this flank, the first encounter between Soviet and American troops of the war also took place. The two forces met near the town of Torgau, or Thurgau. Together, they destroyed the Führer Escort Brigade, an armored unit tasked with protecting Hitler. Men from both countries continued to fight together until the end of the war. Until April 19th, fighting continued at Seelow and in the surrounding areas. Although thousands of communist soldiers fell to German gunfire or artillery, they had more than 1 million men. If one died, he was quickly replaced by another. That night, the Soviets reached the last German defensive line still standing, and within a few hours they managed to break it. The German 4th and 9th armies had to retreat, as they were in danger of being annihilated. On April 20th, the day Adolf Hitler turned 56, the final phase of this campaign was launched, called the Stettin-Rostock Offensive. Its goal was to continue to gain ground on Germany so that it would not fall into Western hands after the Nazi surrender. It was commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky and his 2nd Belarusian Front, which fought against the German 3rd Panzer Army. Rokossovsky was one of the most successful military men of the entire Second World War, having fought and won several of the most important victories, such as Kursk, Kyiv, and Warsaw. The outcome of this operation was no different. This offensive was carried out in conjunction with the beginning of the attack on Berlin, led by the communist Marshal Zhukov, which began with a massive artillery barrage on the capital. Many civilians died in these first hours, but this was only the beginning. In the following days, the 4th and 9th armies were cornered near Frankfurt. Although some managed to escape, most of the Nazi fighters were killed in the fighting or captured. Rokossovsky then advanced into northern Germany and encountered British forces, while Zhukov continued his attacks on the capital. The battle would continue for nearly 3 weeks. Hitler, desperate, ordered that all Berliners take up arms and join the defense of the city. Anyone who did not do so could be executed as a traitor. Many suffered this fate. Yet despite the sacrifice of Berliners, whether voluntary or forced, the battle was already lost. Nearly 2.5 million Soviets faced 800,000 poorly equipped, battered, and demoralized Germans. Urban combat was brutal, but it was something the Red Army specialized in, unlike the German forces who preferred open battle. Defensive encirclements fell one after another as Stalin's men and women came ever closer to the bunker where Hitler was holed up.
As the Soviets break into the buildings and start attacking the German defenders there, they're also encountering German civilians who are getting killed and slaughtered in the fighting just as badly as the soldiers. It's an ungodly and awful, horrifically nasty battle.
On April 30th, with all hope gone, the Führer decided to take his own life along with his wife, Eva Braun. Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, and his wife followed suit the next day after poisoning their 6 children. Before committing suicide, they left orders for the remaining generals not to surrender under any circumstances and to fight to the death. But with the most fanatical Nazis out of the picture, these officers saw no reason to continue fighting a battle that could not be won. On May 8th, they signed the unconditional surrender of Germany's forces. The war in Europe was finally over. The victory at Seelow and its surroundings while it may pale in comparison to the brutal fighting in Berlin, also resulted in an enormous number of deaths. Around 100,000 men, including the last experienced German units, were annihilated in just a few weeks. The Oder-Neisse offensive undoubtedly sealed the fate of the Third Reich and was what led to its destruction and the fall of Hitler.
On September 8, 1941, Adolf Hitler decreed the annihilation of Leningrad and began a siege. This was the first of 872 days of cold, hunger, and death in the Soviet city. A long list of events turned the siege of Leningrad into the longest battle of the entire Second World War, generating intolerable isolation for the population and immeasurable fatigue for the soldiers. Today, in this new installment of military history, we will put ourselves in the shoes of the people who lived through this inevitable event, which occurred in the theater of operations on the Eastern European Front.
По генеральному плану на месте Ленинграда должен был остаться небольшой населенный пункт – 200 тысяч человек. 3 миллиона ленинградцев должны быть уничтожены. Был четкий приказ Гитлера – стереть Ленинград с лица земли.
At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Führer had set as one of his primary goals the devastation of the USSR's key industrial centers. Leningrad was at the eye of the storm, as it housed the communist state's most important shipyards, weapons factories, and steel plants. Furthermore, taking this urban center meant disrupting rail transport, which carried Allied aid from the Arctic ports. There was another symbolic reason, very valuable to the Nazi leader. Leningrad was the new name for the former capital of the Tsarist Empire, St. Petersburg. That city, founded by Peter the Great, had fallen during the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Having been renamed in honor of Vladimir Lenin, its conquest would deal a severe blow to the heart of communism, which Hitler longed to suppress.
Верховного командования. Лето 1941 года Гитлер посещает группу армий «Север», «Норд» и говорит: «Чрезвычайно важное значение имеет Ленинград. В сравнении со значением Ленинграда, Москва – это всего лишь географический объект на карте».
The German army that surrounded Leningrad in 1941 encountered 200,000 Russian soldiers and whatever palisades the citizens were able to erect to defend themselves. The Nazi offensive was lethal. On that same day, a bombardment was unleashed in which 6,000 incendiary bombs demolished the building that stored the population's food reserves. 5 days later, the city of Novgorod was also reduced. Inside Leningrad, artillery and anti-aircraft batteries played a decisive role. However, German Air Force superiority allowed it to bomb the city. Thus, the Luftwaffe destroyed the food warehouses in the city center. Storing all the food supplies within a single complex of buildings was a mistake for which the Soviets paid dearly. Before the route to Moscow was blocked by the destruction, Leningrad residents contributed essential resources to sustain the nation's capital. These contributions continued even after the siege of ancient St. Petersburg began.
В тактическом смысле, в военном смысле была ключевым объектом сражений, и все ресурсы должны были быть направлены прежде всего на битву под Москвой. И, конечно же, Ленинград, несмотря на критичность ситуации и попытки неоднократные прорыва блокады, может быть, сейчас это будет звучать странным, направлял в помощь Москве, в помощь командованию, главному командованию.
For their part, Leningrad's civilian population suffered firsthand from Marshal Clement Voroshilov's poor decisions, which cost him his position commanding the city's defense. First, residents who were no longer useful to the war were not evacuated. Second, an appropriate defense of the city was not arranged before the wall was closed. These serious errors did not cost Voroshilov his life, only because he was a personal friend of Stalin. However, the marshal was dismissed and demoted to a position in the rear. It was then that Marshal Georgy Zhukov took command, who would later distinguish himself in the final fall of Berlin. Voroshilov had received a letter written by the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, stating, "Hand over command to Zhukov and return to Moscow immediately." There he was judged incompetent for his post. Marshal Zhukov made several decisions to preserve Leningrad. Initially, the city was divided into 6 defense zones. Furthermore, the fortifications were expanded and new trenches were built. The Baltic Fleet was also ordered to use its cannons against nearby German positions. Food rationing prevailed within the besieged city. Workers received 500 grams of bread per day, children and employees 300, and the unemployed only 250. This distribution was not sufficient, as supplies were dwindling even faster than expected. In the first month alone, it was announced that there was only enough sugar to last 2 months, and meat and grain for 35 days. As if that were not enough, the winter was extremely cold, reaching minus 40 degrees Celsius. Because of this, the daily distribution of bread was redrawn. 300 grams for workers, 250 for employees, and 125 for children and the unemployed.
Говорит Ленинград. Передаем постановление Государственной комиссии по продовольственному снабжению и Совета Ленинградского фронта о снижении норм хлеба по избежанию перебоев в обеспечении хлеба. Установить следующие нормы о употреблении.
The meager portions of bread began to be supplemented with whatever meat was available. The various species of animals in the zoo were slaughtered at the beginning of winter. Then came the turn of every pet and domestic animal that crossed the street. Later, a fraction of the wallpaper mixture, made from potato derivatives, was mixed with old shoe leather and belts to produce a rather peculiar edible jelly. Weeds, wild plants, and weeds were also cooked. Meanwhile, Russian scientists were investigating ways to extract vitamins from the pine needles, which were abundant in the region. Nature also seemed to resent the atmosphere of death caused by the war. Vegetation and bulbs had vanished from the city squares. The cries of crows resembled heartbreaking cries for food. Throughout the city, no dogs, cats, ducks, rats, pigeons, or any other bird species could be seen. The people's desperation produced gruesome spectacles, with thousands taking up cannibalism. 1 year and 3 months after the siege of Leningrad, in December 1942, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs arrested 2,105 people accused of being cannibals. These individuals were divided into 2 classes: corpse eaters and people eaters. The former devoured the bodies of dead human beings, and the latter murdered comrades in order to devour them. Only 2% of those arrested had a criminal record. The growing risk of death by starvation repeatedly weakened the social pact.
Пришел домой, он не выдержал. У них раньше была поросенок был. Он убил девочку, соседскую. А его дочка была у дедушки с бабушкой. И с ней сделал все, как делают с домашними животными. Сварил суп, и пришла его дочка. Он ее накормил супом и отправил к дедушке с бабушкой, чтобы она им отнесла.
Such gruesome tales were commonplace during the siege of Leningrad. They ranged from a plumber who killed his wife to feed his son and other relatives, to a woman who executed her 18-month-old daughter to feed the victim's siblings. Amid these grotesque scenes, other improvised foods were used, such as seeds for livestock. cattle hides and bones were also boiled for several hours until they reached the consistency of meat jam, as it was called. Sawdust was also left to ferment to make a soup believed to nourish the body, or mixed with flour to make bread. Supplies arriving across Lake Ladoga were very scarce. In summer, they were transported by boats and barges, which were easy prey for Luftwaffe planes. In winter, they were transported across the brittle ice. When the German Junkers sank a shipment, the Russians sent diving teams to salvage whatever they could. From the damp and moldy grain they recovered, they made flour for baking bread. Entire families died of hypothermia in their own homes. People fainted in public places from lack of food, and groups of body collectors carried makeshift wheelbarrows. The Leningrad Scientific Institute developed a type of flour from sawdust and mollusk shells. Leningrad residents were consuming barely 10% of the calories necessary for bodily function. Thousands died from malnutrition. Consequently, unmet physiological needs clouded the reasoning of Leningrad's residents, making it easy for them to fall into the traps set by their enemies. Another evil that plagued the entire population occurred during the winter season of 1941 and 1942. Funeral teams were overwhelmed by the proliferation of corpses in the streets, and the bodies lying on the sidewalks became food for rats. Sooner rather than later, the rodents caused a veritable infestation. Thanks to the absence of natural predators in Leningrad, these small mammals were able to wreak havoc after havoc. They devoured everything that seemed fit for consumption and bit sick elderly people and malnourished children. The solution came with the importation of Siberian cats, which were known to be the most skilled mouse hunters. The cats were transported in 4 heavily guarded train cars. Upon their release through Leningrad, the local residents affectionately referred to them as the Meow Division. While the cats were able to control the situation for a time, many of them were killed by the bites of diseased rats. As casualties mounted, new cats were sent to replenish the ranks. The Soviet people's will to live and continue resisting took on different expressions among their people. One of the most important was sport, which served as a channel of energy and a bond capable of forming a community despite the catastrophe.
А вот еще одна тайна блокады – футбол. В почти мертвом городе как главный живой символ – футбол. Значит, город не мертвый. Сигнал врагу. Красные майки против синих. Удары по мячу. Стадион. Зрители на лавочках. В фуражке сидит знаменитый писатель Николай Тихон.
This vigor to rebel against oppression was evident among the Soviet troops. They refused to be defeated. So the Russian army spent almost 2.5 years trying to break the siege. The Germans, for their part, did not sit idly by. While they awaited the city's debacle, they erected ground defenses that thwarted their enemies' revolts. The 2 major liberation attempts against the Germans took place during the summer of 1942 and the winter of 1943. The triumph bore fruit. While they were unable to expel the German troops, they succeeded in reopening supply routes for the besieged. In January 1944, Soviet soldiers managed to break the siege and the German encirclement. In May and June, the Nazis were finally expelled. Leningrad stood firm, and Hitler's attempts to seize control of the factories were thwarted, although the cost in lives was too high. Soviet troops suffered the loss of nearly 2.5 million soldiers. The communist propaganda machine sought to portray the end of the siege as a resounding victory for their side, although the number of casualties simply couldn't match that perspective. Now, after delving into the adventures of the Nazi siege of Leningrad, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for being with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next video.